Let's open up the Vintage Collection 3.75-inch figure of the Rebel Soldier in Echo-Base battle gear.
Varykino. If it's Star Wars, we collect it.
Hello there, thanks for visiting Varykino. A couple of weeks ago, I placed an online order with a local New Zealand retailer that was clearing out some older Star Wars figures, so I made use of the sale and picked up a vintage collection figure that I had somehow missed in my collection. This one is an older figure, VC68, the Rebel Soldier. Now, of course, when it comes to army building Star Wars scenes, I don't think you can ever have too many Star Wars action figures for an epic Hoth battle, especially with the scale of those massive AT-AT vehicles. I think you just need tons of figures to really flesh out that scene, so you can never go wrong. Even if you have this figure, you can always have more. So I'm really excited to add at least one more Rebel Soldier to my Hoth battle display. I can't wait to open them up. Thank you so much for hanging out with me today. Coming up really soon, I'll open up this figure. We'll take a closer look at the costume details and the accessory, but first let's take a quick look at the backing card. The packaging for the modern vintage collection line is heavily inspired by the original vintage Kenner backing cards from the 1970s and 80s. Here I have the vintage collection backing card on the left and the original Kenner vintage backing card on the right. They both have the split Star Wars logo with double chrome racetrack at the top, and also they both have the Empire Strikes Back film logo in red at the top as well, with a single chrome racetrack design surrounding the character art on the right on both backing cards. But you can see, while both of these are labeled as a Rebel Soldier, they are different. This is the closest vintage equivalent for this particular figure. You can see the actual costume design on both of these are very close, but the backing card art is completely different. Where they can, the modern Hasbro line does try to replicate the original vintage backing cards, but because there are many different Rebel outfits for the Hoth battle, they have tried to make this one more accurate. You can see the tan vest, the helmet and goggles very closely matches the character art here on the modern backing card, while this one depicts a Rebel Soldier outside in the icy trenches on Hoth wearing quite a different outfit. So while this one has the subtext Hoth battle gear, the modern equivalent has the subtext Echo-Base battle gear, which I think is a much better accurate depiction of the actual action figure, though I think it's fun to see just how close this modern action figure resembles the original vintage figure. Taking a closer look at the backing card here, we have the orange accent color for this particular Rebel Soldier for both the nameplate up here with the black font that reads Rebel Soldier in brackets Echo-Base battle gear, and also that orange accent color in behind the figure. Now it looks like the figure itself is a really close match for the reference art that we have here to the side, with one tiny little detail that's different. It looks like the rank badge buttons are just a little bit different in color sequence to the one pictured here on the backing card art. There is a blue button right at the end, whereas this sequence does not seem to include that blue button at the end, but that is such a minor detail that I'm sure I'm going to completely forget once I open up the figure. We can see that the action figure comes with one blaster pistol accessory packaged in there, but I think that is all he really needs. We don't need anything extra there. Moving on to the back of the backing card, this one is an older design, of course. This is VC68, released when Hasbro was still doing the black backgrounds for their backing cards. We have the Star Wars logo here with the double chrome racetrack design with the vintage collection logo underneath, and a bit of an assortment here of colored rectangles depicting other action figures available in that particular wave. You can see some fantastic characters in there like IG-11, Lobot, Bib Fortuna, and Bo-Katan Kryze. The rest of the backing card is the barcode, copyright, all of that kind of stuff. Takes up a lot of space, but that is par for the course of modern figures, where we have to have a lot of safety information there. So overall, I do like the fact that Hasbro has deviated a little from the original Kenner backing card, but it still has a lot of vintage vibes. I like the composite picture here showing an actor on set rather than modern airbrushed art. I think that's looked really nice, especially side by side with the figure where it really matches. I really like it when the art matches the figure exactly, and I think that that is a good good upgrade from the original vintage backing card, which had a very dark panel for the character art there to the right. So overall, I'm excited to add a new Rebel Soldier to my Hoth battle display. So let's open this one up. So now I have the Rebel Soldier action figure out of the packaging, as well as the blaster accessory, so we can take a closer look. Thankfully, he stood up pretty well out of the packaging. That's always a good sign. I didn't have to adjust his legs too much. But the major thing that I really noticed when I took him out of the bubble was just how easily this little goggle accessory is to remove. It just fell off his head. So I thought I would take a closer look at this particular aspect first. So on some older figures, this is sculpted on the hat here, kind of just above the visor. But of course, in doing that, if it's cast all as one piece with the head and face, it's not going to be translucent. So I was wondering whether this would actually sort of fit down over the eyes to be worn. Maybe that's why it's made out of translucent plastic, so we could put it down and see it over the eyes. But I don't see how that's going to work. It's quite sort of, it's not a tight fit, but there are so many details on the top of this hat, like this little scarf section here, this little greebly with antenna, that it just kind of sits here over the top. It's not a tight fit. It does kind of want to come off very easily, but unless I'm sort of adventurous and pop his head off and maybe try to sort of put it up underneath, sort of pulling it up over his chin up to his eyes, I'm not sure how I'm supposed to use this. I thought maybe it would have a split in the back, so you can just sort of pull it apart and sort of put it around his eyes, but this is a continuous piece. It doesn't split apart. I know some older figures just kind of have this as a glued on piece with the strap kind of sculpted into the rest of the hat, but this is just an interesting sort of piece. And I kind of wish that the painting continued around the edges, because when I put it there, when you look at the top, you can really see that translucent yellow in the cross section. I kind of wish that cut edge around the top was painted as well, so it blend in to the hat a little bit better. But I do like the fact that we have this as a piece. I think those goggles are so iconic in the Rebel Alliance. We see them in sort of the X-Wing helmets across the visors, and of course in the Rebel outfits as well. And of course, I guess this being removable rather than being permanently attached means that if you want to sort of mix up your army builders, you can simply take it off, or as I mentioned earlier, if you're game, you might be able to even get it up over his eyes if you pull his head off and try that trick. But I've got to say, this plastic scarf section does actually come down quite low here at the side. If I just pull that out to the side, you can kind of see just how low down that is. It's kind of down around this level, so I'm not sure that we'd even be able to get the strap up high enough to cover his eyes. So to be honest, I'm not even sure that that is going to be an option. But I do like its appearance here. I just kind of wish it's kind of sat a little bit more snugly. It does kind of just sit there. It's just kind of balancing. It's not really hiding. There doesn't seem to be any kind of sculpting part that this wants to kind of naturally rest in. And it does kind of go over that antenna, which I don't know if that's my favorite, though. I guess if this is the part that's going to move, it would be worn over the antenna. But because it does come off so easily, I'm just going to put it to the side. But I do like the fact that this is included. It is clearly visible in that reference image on the backing card. So I think that that's a fun component, but perhaps not my preferred way of doing it. So moving on to the rest of the figure, of course, we've got this Rebel Hoth hat here, kind of completely covers the head, so we don't see any hair. We have a little bit of sort of a cap here at the front, a little bit of a high section here. We've got a silver sort of walkie-talkie communication greebly here on the side with a little antenna. This one technically doesn't really have too much wobble to it. I'm trying to just kind of maybe bends a little bit. I think it must be made out of the same plastic as this, so I don't think it would snap off. There's going to be a little bit of bend and flex to it because it seems to be in the same piece as that, but I'm certainly not going to test that fully in theory. So this piece from this sort of sash bit around the top of the hat, it does look like it's all in one piece, which is kind of interesting because oftentimes we don't really see the faces sculpted in the slightly more sort of movable plastic. It's not as rubbery as some of the sections used for the lower tunics of Jedi characters and such. So it's not really rubbery, but it does flex. So I'm hoping that that means that we're going to be able to turn the head around to get some articulation there. In terms of the paint job, it doesn't look too bad. It's kind of simple. We've got white for the quilted sort of padded section running around the back of the head. We've got kind of a slightly different white, kind of like an off-white across the top of the hat, and also for the brim of sort of the cap section. We've got a dark brown for this kind of sash slash scarf, I guess, tied around the top. There is a little section here where the paint doesn't quite match up, very, very minimal there, but overall it's quite nice and interesting just how nicely it actually runs down on the cheeks, because this isn't a separate piece attached over the top. This looks like this is all fully sculpted with the face, which is an interesting choice. Sometimes when you've got long hair, it is sculpted as a separate section that is attached to the face component. This looks like it is all one piece, and I've got to say, I'm very grateful to see that the painting line adds the white onto the flesh tone. There is a nice tidy match. We've even got a little face detail there underneath with the eyebrows, eyes, and just a little touch of color on the lips. This does look like a slightly older paint job. Of course, this is an older figure, so that does match, but it's not like googly-eyed or anything like that. I think maybe the painting on this eye is just a little bit darker than the one on the other side, but overall not too bad. And even those eyebrows tucked all the way under that cap brim there are pretty nice as well. So pretty cool. It's just a shame that the goggles aren't over the eyes, or in a way that I could actually use them over the eyes. But of course it does match up to how we see them in Echo Base. They're not really sort of running around with their goggles on inside the base, so that fits. Moving on to the rest of the sculpting, we've kind of got this sort of cream color snowsuit with padded sleeves here. We've got a pocket on this arm and one with sort of the code cylinders like we see on the X-Wing pilots on this arm. Though we do have to note on this arm there seems to be a very small hole in the plastic. That's not a paint flaw, that's actually a very tiny hole that I can feel with my fingernail there. I do like the painting on the code cylinder here on this left sleeve. That's quite nice. Moving down, of course, we've got these sort of gauntlet style gloves, the same color here as the sleeves, but we've got the gray for the section there around the wrist. And on this side, we've got that same gray, but we've got a little bit of a comlink panel here, sort of a little bit of painted greeblies with white and a couple of different colors. They're very small details and they're painted quite well. The vest here is kind of a pale brown, kind of a caramel color here. Really nice sort of quilting. We've got that raised collar that we see on a lot of the Hoth Rebel outfits, including Luke's snowspeeder jacket there. Some quilting in the back here, and we've got a very small little rank badge there with some very tiny painted little buttons. The top row, as best as my eyes can see, I will put an insert shot here. It looks like we have perhaps a blue button and then 3 red, and then it looks like maybe 4 blue or black on the lower row there. It is very small, and at that scale my eyes are having a little bit of trouble really defining the difference between blue and black, but I'll try to put as best photo in there as I can to show the detail there. To my eyes, they look reasonably well painted against that metallic silver sort of plate behind them there, and the plate itself is painted well against the caramel color of the vest. Very nice there. Moving on, if I just move his arm out of the way, we've got a holster which is quite nicely attached. It's kind of hanging out from underneath the vest, which is nice, and it is quite rubbery actually. That flexes a lot, and I can even kind of move it side to side, up and down. I'm hoping that the blaster accessory is going to fit nicely in here, but that's a nice addition. I do like being able to stow accessories on the figures themselves, even if they're not holding them. He does have quite the extended trigger finger, so I'm hoping he's going to pose well with that blaster accessory. Moving down to the pants, they kind of remind me of sort of off-white versions of X-Wing pilot outfits here. We've got the sort of pockets on the thighs, pockets lower down here, tucked into sort of mid-calf black boots that have a little bit of detail around the ankles. They're not glossy, which is kind of interesting. I guess that kind of works. I always think of sort of that high shine on the boots as being quite imperial, having a sort of time and perhaps even assistance to shine their shoes. So it kind of works there. The painting on the sort of the ankle ankle part here, that looks glossy, so I believe that is painted. I believe the legs would be made out of this color plastic, with this lower section here being black painted, while the boots, because we can see sort of a little bit of a cross section with that cutout for the peg hole in the underside, would be made out of a black. So there is a tiny mismatch in the level of gloss. The boots are a little bit more of a matte plastic finish, while this section here is a little bit more of a gloss painted finish. But when you put them on display, it's really hard to tell. I'm looking up very close. So overall, quite nice painting, because a lot of the costume elements are separated into separate plastic made components, so there's very little painting, just the sort of small sections, and it all looks pretty well painted. There is one tiny little note. I do have the tiniest little black speck here on the front of the vest that doesn't seem to want to come off, so that is some tiny little mark there, but again, when I put him in my Hoth display, I'm not going to notice that. So overall, he looks pretty good, though I think he could probably stand to have that updated photorealistic printing for the face. I think that would just take it just a tiny bit up a notch, and just that tiny little section here where the brown paint didn't quite closely follow the sculpting of that sash scarf there along the top. But other than that, he looks pretty cool. He's even got like kind of a little bit, I don't know if it's intentional or just like a little bit of accidental paint on the back, kind of giving him just a little bit of sort of weathering to the back. I don't know if this is supposed to sort of highlight the sort of crisscross quilting on the back of his vest, or this is simply a little bit of paint transfer while sort of handling and assembling the figure. It's a little bit hard to tell. I think I can catch just a tiny hint of silver in there, so I'm not sure that that's entirely intentional. That's probably just a little bit sort of a rubbing off on the hands of whoever assembled this one, because we do have a few silver elements. I don't think that's supposed to be there on a fabric component for the outfit there, but overall really fun. One thing that I do note with the articulation, just looking at the figure and the sculpting work, I don't see a cut through in the mid-torso. A lot of modern figures have a sort of a mid-torso articulation line that completely cuts through the figure, so we can twist them side to side and bend them front and back. This chest section, this vest, there is no cut through line here, so the articulation for the waist is going to be completely under the figure, which is kind of unheard of in the modern vintage collection figure line. That sort of mid-torso articulation is very important, and I love to see that in the modern figures. And I don't think the articulation here in the legs is going to be very good. This looks like a much older style. It kind of reminds me of the 5-point of articulation, or even the vintage figures, the way it sort of cuts in here around the hip. So I'm not expecting a lot of movement here for this particular figure. He might just be swinging backwards and forwards with his legs, but of course this is a much older figure, so I'm expecting some of those older articulation styles that we don't see in the modern vintage line, the vintage collection line. So let's go through and test out his maneuverability, because of course we want to do some really cool action shots. I know technically he is inside Echo Base, but of course Darth Vader and the Empire troopers do invade the base, so perhaps he can be doing those sorts of fighting scenes. So his neck is stiff, he's a little bit older, but he can turn once I get him going. Of course that scarf section does move quite clearly over the shoulders. It's not impacting his ability to look side to side. There's actually a lot of sort of roll there that's quite nice. Sometimes hats, and especially with this high sort of collar here to his vest, I thought it might stop his ability to look up, but actually that cap is just tucking in nicely with that collar there, so he can actually look up quite a bit, probably more than I would be looking upwards in a character. And you can see just the sculpting of that sort of cap kind of creating a little bit of a strap underneath the chin there, which is fun to see. Yeah, that's really nice. I like the fact that we've kind of got a little bit of the white undersuit peeking out there at the top of the collar. That is a painted section that looks pretty well painted, just a tiny bit of the white on the neck, just a little bit higher than perhaps the sculpting would indicate. But yeah, that's a nice detail that's a bit more visible when you're moving the neck around. So I'm not particularly fond of the way that this shoulder looks. It's a little hard to see against the white background, just the way it kind of rolls out. It's just kind of got a little bit of a sculpting piping that just kind of makes it look like an action figure arm. But perhaps because it is cut in here with the sort of shoulder of this vest section, I'm hoping maybe that's going to give us some added maneuverability there. So moving his arm up to the side as best I can, it's going to stop about there. It looks pretty tight. We're not getting a lot of gaps there as I move his arm up. Let's have a look at this one. That one is kind of hitting about a similar point. So not completely level, but that's not too bad. I was kind of expecting maybe a little bit more of a tucking under that shoulder piece to get all the way up, but it is really just hitting there. So I guess that's okay. Swiveling the arms up. Let's see how tight into the body we can get. Okay, we get to about there. Again, not looking too bad. Something about this one's just looking like, it's probably just my figure. It's just like a little bit kind of, I don't know, stuck out a little bit. It's just kind of creating this sort of rounded cap at the shoulder. That is not my favorite sort of look. Okay, so this looks pretty standard in terms of the sculpting and articulation for the elbow. So let's test that out. For certain color tones, the articulation just really hides nicely. I'm hoping this pale color is not going to stand out too well. This elbow is a little bit stiff. I'm just being a little bit careful there. So that's pretty good. We can get the elbows in quite close to the body. Not that he has like a two-handed lightsaber weapon or anything like that. I can't quite get the hands to, like, if I squeeze, I can kind of get them close together. But of course, he's not going to be holding a lightsaber. He's got a blaster, but that looks pretty good. Interesting that both fingers are extended, though this one is a bit more of a hook. We can see there that's going to be a good trigger finger. This one's kind of more of a point, which is interesting. A lot of times the left hand is just in sort of a classic I'm holding something grip. Interesting that that one is actually an extended finger. You don't often see two extended fingers on a figure that only has one weapon to hold. That's kind of interesting. So I guess we'll test out that blaster in both hands and see if this slightly less hooked extended finger is going to work as a trigger finger as well. So I'm really hoping that's going to be the case. So, ooh, okay. We have an articulation point here at the end of sort of the gauntlet flared part of the glove. That's kind of fun. It's going to rotate at that section. That's not something we get on all figures, so that is nice. Is that because... Okay, so it's articulating there, not at the wrist. I thought this would be the perfect spot to have an articulation point for the wrist, but I guess because these are sort of running into the gloves, it would cut in and make these look perhaps a little bit odd. So instead of articulating here, they are pivoting here instead, which means we're not going to get any of that articulation or the side-to-side rocking either, because you can see that plastic just completely runs into this gauntlet section there. So if you do like that subtle maneuverability at the wrists, this figure does not have that, but we can rotate there, which I guess is kind of accurate. If you're going to be turning your hand, this section of your gloves is going to move too. We just don't get that rocking. So hopefully that still means that we can do some cool blaster accessory poses. But yeah, continuing on with the slightly different articulation, we don't have that mid-torso movement. So let's see how well I can turn him to the side. Okay, that's not too bad. There's his front. You can see that the holster is moving with the torso rather than being still with the pants. I think I perhaps prefer it to stay still, but of course I can't see up underneath there. It's just tucked in so tightly, so I can't really see where it is attached, but that is moving with the top again if I move it that way as well. There is a little bit of resistance. I don't want to sort of... Let's see. Okay, let's just go. He can turn all the way around. Okay, so that's kind of interesting. I was a little bit worried. Some of the figures, they kind of feel like something's giving quite sharp resistance when you try and tip them too far beyond sort of looking to the side, but he can swing all the way around. He's not really going to be sort of pivoting. You can see that the hip section is just going to move to allow him to sort of bend forward rather than at that higher point. So very simple, kind of feels like almost a 5-point of articulation there. And you can see that this section is painted. So it's just a little bit different to the plastic of the legs. It looks a little bit odd. So I'm just giving it a quick test. That is not going to the side. So very much an older style of articulation there in the legs, almost that sort of 5-point. We're just swinging front to back because we've got those sharp lines. He's not doing too much. I can bend him to the back, bend him to the front a little bit. I don't think I get him seated in a cockpit. That's just too much of a resistance because of this vest coming in so low. I like the fact that the vest comes down and kind of hides articulation around the hips, but in this case it's completely sort of stopping us from going all the way forward. Though of course, because we can't go out to the side, it's not really providing any resistance to the side because we simply can't do that movement. Checking out the knees, I like the fact that the knee articulation is cutting just across the top of the pockets on the lower legs. I think that does a pretty good job of hiding it, and you can just see the plastic articulation there at the back of the knees. That monotone sort of for the pants is doing a really good job of hiding it there, tucked in with a little bit of sculpting lines and kind of the creases and folds in the pants there, so that's nice. So again, a little older figure. Let's bend the knees, hope he's gonna move okay. Okay, so he can rotate at the knees. We can swing those around and I can get him into kind of a kneeling position. That's not too bad. We can see the knee articulation there at the front. He's of course not going to bend forward in the front. That hits very straight, but yes, we can rotate at the knees there if you want to sort of turn the feet out, because I'm just gonna go out on a limb here because of the articulation at the wrists kind of being up higher. Yeah, that is, let's see, trying to look at the black on black articulation. This feels like there's a join here, but I can't actually see the angle of articulation. I can just kind of see. It's really, really hard to see against the matte black. You can kind of just see it there in the back, but it's, there we go. It's very stiff. Okay, so I can just point his boot there. Just trying to see, oh, there we go. Okay, it was very stiff. I'm always a little bit nervous when the articulation is a little bit different. I don't want to sort of force it in case it's not really designed. But okay, so there is articulation there that rolls. That was just a little bit stiff, and he can tip his foot back to sort of point his toe, long toe there. But yes, so good. I was a little bit worried that we might have kind of sort of at the top of the boot articulation and not much else. But yeah, so ankle articulation there is a little bit of paint flecking off on my hands as I'm handling him. I'm hoping that's not sort of coming off into too much of a major way. But yeah, interesting articulation. I was sort of, I haven't opened a figure as old as this one in quite a while, so it's kind of been a little bit of a refresher course for my memory in terms of the older articulation for the figures. But yeah, interesting. Just giving the holster a little bit of a squeeze. That is really rubbery, so I'm hoping that's going to be a good fit. You can see that it is sort of hollow with that gap, square-shaped gap there at the end, so I'm hoping that that really cool silver emitter is going to poke out the bottom there. So let's take a look at the blaster accessory. So we've got the very famous Rebel blaster here with the silver sort of pointed end here. We have a circular enclosed trigger guard here. The rest of the gun looks pretty nice. We've got some sculpted detail. It's very hard to see because it's black. That raised detail does look nice. It is, I gotta say, quite rubbery. I can bend it quite a lot side to side. It's not my favorite, but it does do the job pretty well for the level of detail. But you just got to watch these ones in terms of the poses so they don't get a little bit bent with the position of the hand. Sometimes they can sort of really bend. It is quite thin, but the painting, it looks like it's made out of just black plastic with just this silver tip painted. So it's got a narrow grip, so I'm hoping it's going to go in his hand quite well. I'm going to test it in the right hand. That's usually the hand that a lot of figures hold the blaster. So the grip went into the hand pretty easily, and I just had to hook that finger in there and it goes in really easily. A lot of room around the finger in that trigger guard there, so it's not a tight fit. He holds that very easily. And let's just carefully test that in his left hand, because we've actually got an extended trigger finger here on this other side. So his finger is a little bit more pointed rather than curled. So it does kind of points into the trigger guard. It's not completely hooking all the way through, but it does actually hold that pretty well. So I guess that makes him a really good army builder. Some of your rebel soldiers are going to be right-handed and some of them are going to be left-handed. So you can kind of mix it up. Maybe some are wearing their goggles, maybe some aren't. It's just the posing. You're not going to get a lot of deep knee poses or anything like that with this particular figure. So yeah, let's test that blaster in the holster here. I'm hoping this is going to fit in quite nicely. That's really nice. That fits in quite deep. Wow, that goes in really easily. So yeah, you can see that that silver tip is just sort of coming through there at the bottom. Let's test to see. Oh, that's really easy to take out. Not that it's going to fall out, but it's not really holding tight. I don't like it when some figures really feels like it's going to be a bit of a mission to get it back out. And that does feel that that holds it quite nicely. So maybe they are attending a rebel briefing in the base and they don't want to be sort of wielding their blasters. So you could have them sort of just with them in the holster. That's really nice. So you've got 3 different blaster poses there, holstered right hand and left hand, which is some very good variability for a figure that is kind of intended to be an army builder figure. So that's a lot of fun. Now let's just get his goggles back on to kind of complete the look here. They do kind of want to bounce up a little bit. They're a little bit hard to get in place because they don't press down in a tight way. So you while this is easy to get into position, this is kind of just a little bit, it's kind of a bit precarious. It's just kind of balanced there, but I did play around with the legs and he stands up pretty well on his own, even though I've sort of bent his legs as far as I could test in terms of the articulation. So while he does have a lot of upgrades compared to the original figure, I do think that yeah, the articulation in the legs does make me think very much of the older vintage style articulation. You can kind of see them side by side with just that sort of very squarish cutout there in the hips. I really think that this one would be, you know, perhaps superseded by the modern articulation style. But again, this is an older figure and I don't mind it when it is these army builder figures that Hasbro kind of evolves, adapts, creates different versions, different sculpts. So when you put a lot of them on your display, they're going to look different. So honestly, I don't mind having a few of these older figures because they can be slightly towards the back and I put the more modern ones with better articulation and perhaps a slightly more modern paint job more towards the front because you're going to need lots of them anyway. And it does sort of hit the wallet a little bit hard whenever a new army builder drops. You don't really wanting to be buying 30 or 40 of them because you know it's inevitable that they're going to be superseded by better figures in the future. So buying a handful at a time is always a good approach. So I'm really happy to have one more rebel soldier for my Hoth scene because I love Hoth scenes. I've got the really big AT-AT that Hasbro released a few years ago and I just love building out the scene. I do wish that it snowed where I live because I would love to take some photos of my Hoth battle out in the snow. Maybe one day I'll take a special trip just to take some cool scenery photos of my action figures, but for now it's on display in our action figure room and I'm really happy to have one more figure for my collection. Thank you so much for hanging out with me today as I opened up another vintage collection figure and had a lot of fun checking out the details. I hope you have a wonderful morning, afternoon or evening, wherever you are in the galaxy, and let's hang out again really soon for more Star Wars fun. May the Force be with you. If you're a vintage collection fan, I recently opened up the Moff Jerjerrod figure, VC68. That video is linked here in case you haven't already seen it, as well as a whole vintage collection playlist. This is the way.